Hello, you've come to this video because you're not sure about how to answer the question, to what extent did the 20th century see the biggest change in punishments? Well, hopefully you can see on the board an example of some phrases that you can use. A good starting point would be to look at the early modern period, because of course things have had a chance to change since the medieval period. And if you look at the sheet in front of you, it tells you all about the early modern period. And it tells you about some of the things that stayed the same and some of the things that changed. So I'd probably start my answer with, in the early modern period, punishments changed to some extent, but there was also some continuity. For example, something that stayed similar was that prisons, again it's the first thing on the sheet, prisons were still mostly used for people awaiting a trial. What else? Fines were still used, looking down the sheet. And there was capital punishment as well for people. Though, and then you explain those things, how they were used, using the sheet. Then you'd go into another section of your it said, though in the early modern period, there were some significant changes. For example, although prisons were still used, they were now used although prisons were still used for people awaiting trial, they were also used to keep people in who had to pay off debts. And although capital punishment was still used, it changed insofar as they came up with new ways of killing people to try to deter others from committing crime, like hung, drawn and quartered, or burnings. And there were some things that were completely different, like the bloody code was introduced, and transportation was the bloody code was fairly similar because it's still capital punishment for more crimes, but transportation's completely new as a punishment that's been introduced. So you look on the one hand at things that stayed the same, things that changed, and you've done the early modern period, and you summarise your paragraph probably by saying something like, so in summary, the early modern period was largely similar to the Middle Ages for a good chunk of the early modern period, though there were some big changes towards the end, like the bloody code and transportation. Full stop, job done. Then you look at the industrial period. In the industrial period, hey, I tell you what I've missed. In the early modern period paragraph, it's always good in the end of the paragraph to refer back to the question about the 20th century. So perhaps you should have said what I just said and said, so in comparison to the 20th century, it had less change in terms of punishments, or it had more change in terms of punishments. So another alternative is you could start with the 20th century. Doesn't really matter. Anyway, the next paragraph, you go on the industrial period. In the industrial period, there were some significant changes in terms of punishments for crimes, but there were also some elements of change. Stop. For example, the bloody code was still going on, although it did change in the 1820s when it was faded out. Or phased out, should I say. So anyway, you get the idea. You go through looking at similarities and differences, using the sheet, writing about what changed, what stayed the same, and referring at the end of your paragraphs back to the 20th century. Hopefully I've given you some ideas there to help you out if I haven't managed to get round to speak to you. There we go.